drowning in a different way. Her dress clung to her like a second skin, torn at the shoulder, where the current had been cruel. She shivered on the muddy bank, arms wrapped tight around herself, eyes wide with something between fear and shame. Caleb stood 3 feet away, chest heaving from the dive, water streaming from his hair. She said it quietly, barely above the rush of the river. "The water took my clothes. You won't look, right?" He didn't answer. Didn't look. Just slipped his jacket off, the one with the frayed cuffs and paint stains, and held it out behind him, gaze fixed firmly on the tree line. When her fingers brushed his to take it, they were cold as the river itself. He walked away without asking her name, his daughter's hand tucked safely in his own, leaving wet footprints that disappeared into the morning fog. She stood there, wrapped in his coat, watching him fade into the mist, and felt something crack open inside her chest, something that had been frozen for 3 years. Caleb Hayes had learned to live small. The wooden house by the river wasn't much. 2 rooms, a porch that sagged on one side, a roof he patched every spring with whatever materials he could salvage. But it was theirs. His and Rosie's. The 7-year-old was still asleep when he'd heard the scream that morning, her small body curled under the quilt his late wife had sewn years ago. He'd left her there, safe and warm, and run toward the sound without thinking. That was the thing about being a father. Your body moved before your mind caught up. Now, walking home with soaked jeans clinging to his legs and Rosie's questions coming in rapid bursts, he tried not to think about the woman's face, the way her dark eyes had searched his when he turned away, the tremble in her voice, the cold shock of her fingers. He'd seen plenty of people in trouble during his years working construction, back when he had steady work, back before everything fell apart. But something about her felt different, haunted, like she was running from something bigger than a slip on wet rocks. "Daddy, who was that lady?" Rosie tugged his hand, her blonde curls bouncing as she skipped to keep pace with his long strides. She'd woken when he'd returned, dripping wet, full of the burning curiosity that seemed to fuel all children her age. Why was she in the river? Was she swimming? "It's too cold for swimming." "She fell," Caleb said simply, squeezing her hand. The morning sun was starting to burn through the fog, turning everything golden and soft. She needed help. "Did you save her?" Rosie's eyes went wide with admiration. "Like a superhero?" Caleb smiled despite himself, ruffling her hair. "Not a superhero, just a neighbor." That's all he'd ever been good at, showing up when someone needed help, fixing what was broken, asking for nothing in return. It was the one thing his wife had loved about him, back when love had been enough to keep them warm through the hard winters. Now it was just him and Rosie, and the memory of what a family used to feel like. The house smelled like cedar and coffee when they stepped inside. Caleb changed into dry clothes, worn jeans and a flannel shirt with a button missing, while Rosie pulled out her coloring books at the kitchen table. He made her oatmeal with cinnamon, the way she liked it, and watched her eat while his mind drifted back to the river, to the woman, to the way she'd looked at him like he'd done something extraordinary, when all he'd done was the bare minimum of human decency. He didn't expect to see her again. People like that, the ones who rented the big house on the hill, the ones who drove cars that cost more than his yearly income, they didn't come back to say thank you. They moved through the world expecting help, taking it as their due, and forgot about the people who gave it. That was fine. Caleb didn't need gratitude. He just needed to get through each day, keep Rosie fed and happy, and make sure she never felt the kind of loss that had carved him hollow. But 3 days later, she appeared on his porch. Caleb was fixing the railing. The wood had rotted through again, when he looked up and saw her standing at the bottom of the steps. She wore expensive clothes this time, clean and pressed, her dark hair pulled back. But her eyes held the same haunted look. In her hands, She held his jacket, freshly laundered and folded. "You left this," she said. Her voice was different than he remembered, stronger. But there was still something fragile underneath, like ice over deep water. "I wanted to return it." Caleb climbed down from the porch, wiping sawdust from his hands on his jeans. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Could have kept it." "I don't keep things that aren't mine." She held it out to him, and when he took it, their fingers didn't touch this time. She'd made sure of it. "Thank you for that morning." Most people would have. Most people would have helped, Caleb interrupted gently. He didn't want her gratitude. It felt too heavy, too much like debt. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. No, they wouldn't have. She glanced past him at the house, and he saw her gaze catch on something. The door, where Rosie's drawings were taped haphazardly across the screen, bright crayon pictures of flowers and houses and stick-figure families. "You have a daughter." "Rosie." He said her name like it was the only word that mattered. "She's 7. She's lucky." The woman's voice went soft, almost wistful, and Caleb saw something flicker across her face. Pain, sharp and quick. Then it was gone, buried under that polished exterior. "I should go. I just wanted to say thank you." She turned to leave, and Caleb should have let her, should have gone back to fixing the railing, back to the simple rhythm of his small life. But something made him speak. "You're staying at the Riverside property." It wasn't a question. There was only one house fancy enough for someone like her, the sprawling estate that had been empty for years until recently. She looked back at him, surprised. "For now, I needed somewhere quiet." "It's quiet here," Caleb agreed. Then, because Rosie had taught him that kindness cost nothing, he added, "If you need anything, we're just down the path." She studied him for a long moment, like she was trying to solve a puzzle. "Why?" she asked finally. "You don't know me." Don't need to know someone to be neighborly. It was the truth, the only truth he had. Something shifted in her expression, a crack in the armor. "I'm Beatrice," she said. "Caleb." He offered his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. Her grip was firm, but her palm was soft. Hands that had never done hard labor. Hands that had probably signed checks and shaken hands in boardrooms. But when she pulled away, he saw her fingers tremble slightly, and he wondered what had brought someone like her to a quiet river town where nothing ever happened. She left without another word, walking back up the path toward the big house. Caleb watched her go, then turned back to his work. The railing wasn't going to fix itself, and he had Rosie's lunch to make. But that night, when he tucked his daughter into bed and she asked about the pretty lady who'd visited, he found himself saying, "Sometimes people need a quiet place to figure things out." "Is she sad?" Rosie asked, her intuition sharp as always. Children saw things adults tried to hide. "Yeah, sweetheart. I think she is." "Maybe we can make her happy," Rosie said, already half asleep. "Like when you fixed Mrs. Patterson's fence and she smiled." Caleb kissed her forehead. "Maybe," he said. But he knew better. Some kinds of sadness couldn't be fixed with a hammer and nails. The days that followed fell into their usual pattern. Caleb took odd jobs around town, fixing porches, building bookshelves, anything that paid enough to keep food on the table. Rosie went to school, came home with more drawings, talked endlessly about her friends, and her teacher, and the tadpoles in the creek. Life was small and simple and enough. Caleb had made peace with enough. But Beatrice kept appearing, not intentionally, or maybe it was. He'd see her walking by the river in the early mornings, always alone, her expression distant. She'd wave sometimes, a small gesture that seemed to cost her effort. He'd nod back and keep working, whatever he was working on. Replacing a window, splitting firewood, fixing Rosie's bicycle chain, the rhythms of survival. Then came the night Rosie got sick. It started as a cough, nothing serious, but by midnight, her fever had spiked to 103, and she was crying, her small body burning up. Caleb had no car. It had died 6 months ago, and he couldn't afford the repairs. The clinic was 5 miles away. He wrapped Rosie in blankets, held her against his chest, and started walking. The night air was cold, and his daughter was getting heavier with each step. But he kept moving because that's what fathers did. They kept moving. He was 2 miles down the road when headlights swept over them. A car slowed, stopped. Beatrice rolled down the window, her face pale in the dashboard light. "What happened?" "She's sick." Caleb's voice cracked. He hadn't realized how scared he was until someone asked. "Fever. I'm taking her to the clinic." Beatrice didn't hesitate. "Get in." The clinic was small, underfunded, but the doctor on call was kind. She examined Rosie while Caleb paced the waiting room, his hands shaking. Beatrice sat in one of the plastic chairs, silent and still, but present. When the doctor finally came out and said it was just a bad flu, that Rosie would be fine with rest and fluids, Caleb's knees nearly buckled. He went in to see his daughter, found her already sleeping, color returning to her cheeks. He sat beside the bed and put his head in his hands and let himself break, just for a moment. When he came out, Beatrice was still there. She didn't ask if he was okay. She just stood and said, "I'll drive you home." In the car, Rosie slept in the back seat, wrapped in hospital blankets. Caleb stared out the window at the dark landscape sliding past. "Thank you," he said finally. "I don't know what I would have. You would have walked all night if you had to." Beatrice's voice was soft. "That's the kind of father you are." Something in her tone made him look at her. In the dim light from the dashboard, he saw tears on her cheeks. She was crying silently, her hands steady on the wheel, her gaze fixed on the road. "Beatrice?" "I had a son," she said quietly. The words seemed to cost her everything. 3 years ago, he was 8. There was an accident, a car accident. I was driving. Her voice broke. I couldn't save him. Caleb's chest tightened. He didn't know what to say to that kind of pain. There were no words. "Watching you tonight," she continued, "the way you held her, the way you'd have walked through hell to get her help. I remembered what it felt like to love someone that much, to be that desperate. I'd forgotten." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I'm sorry. You don't need to hear this." "It's okay," Caleb said, and he meant it. "I lost my wife, Sarah, cancer, 4 years ago. Rosie was so small she barely remembers her." He swallowed hard. "Some days I'm terrified I'm not enough, that I'm failing her by being the only parent she has left." "You're not failing her." Beatrice's voice was fierce. "She's loved." "That's everything." They drove the rest of the way in silence. When they reached his house, Caleb carried Rosie inside, tucked her into bed. When he came back out, Beatrice was still there, sitting on the porch steps. "You don't have to stay," he said. "I know." She looked up at him. "Can I?" So he sat beside her, and they watched the sun come up together. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Sometimes grief spoke its own language, and they both understood it fluently. After that night, something shifted. Beatrice started visiting more often, never for long, always with some small excuse. She'd bring Rosie art supplies, nice ones, the kind Caleb could never afford. She'd help him fix things around the house, her expensive clothes getting dusty and paint spattered. She'd stay for dinner sometimes. Simple meals of pasta and vegetables, and Caleb would watch her laugh at Rosie's stories about school and wonder when the sadness in her eyes had started to lift, just slightly. Rosie adored her, called her Miss Beatrice, asked her endless questions, showed her every drawing she made, and Beatrice received it all with a gentleness that seemed to surprise even herself. One evening, Caleb found them in the yard, Beatrice teaching Rosie how to skip stones across the river. His daughter's laughter rang out clear and bright, and Beatrice's smile was real this time, reaching her eyes. "She's good with kids," Caleb said when Beatrice came up to the porch for water. "She makes it easy." Beatrice watched Rosie hunt for more flat stones. "She doesn't ask about my past. She just accepts me. Kids are like that." Caleb handed her a glass. "They don't care where you've been, just who you are right now." Beatrice took a long drink, then looked at him seriously. "Can I ask you something? Why did you turn away that morning, at the river?" Caleb had known the question would come eventually. "Because you needed help, not judgment. And because being seen, really seen, when you're at your lowest, when you're exposed and scared, that's not something anyone should have to endure." He met her gaze. "I saw enough. I saw someone who needed kindness." Her eyes filled with tears. "No one's treated me like that in a long time. Like I'm a person instead of a problem, or an asset, or a disappointment." "You're a person," Caleb said simply. "That's all that matters." A week later, a storm rolled in. Not unusual for late spring, but this one was violent. Tearing shingles off roofs and snapping branches like kindling. Caleb had just gotten Rosie inside when he heard the crack, loud as a gunshot. The old oak tree in his yard, the one that had probably stood for a century, split down the middle. Half of it crashed through his roof, punching a hole the size of a car through the bedroom ceiling. Rosie screamed. Caleb grabbed her, pulled her into the kitchen, checked her frantically for injuries. She was fine, just terrified. But the house was not. Rain poured through the gaping hole, soaking everything. The bedroom was destroyed, the living room was flooded, and Caleb stood in the middle of it all, with his daughter in his arms, and felt the weight of impossibility settle on his shoulders. He couldn't afford to fix this. He couldn't afford to fix anything. His phone rang. "Beatrice. Are you okay?" "I heard the tree fall from my house." "We're fine," Caleb said automatically, even as water dripped on his head. "Just some damage?" "How much damage?" He looked at the hole in his roof, at Rosie's ruined bed, at everything he'd worked so hard to maintain. "Enough." 30 minutes later, Beatrice pulled up in her car. She took one look at the house and said, "Pack what you need. You're staying with me." Caleb started to refuse. Pride was a powerful thing. But then Rosie tugged his hand and said, "Daddy, I'm cold." And just like that, his pride didn't matter. The estate was massive, bigger than any house Caleb had ever been in. High ceilings, polished floors, rooms that echoed with emptiness. Beatrice led them to a guest suite on the second floor, 2 bedrooms connected by a bathroom. "It's too much space for one person anyway," she said. Though Caleb suspected she'd lived here alone with all this emptiness by choice, surrounding herself with physical distance to match the emotional kind. That first night was awkward. Rosie was too excited to sleep, running from room to room, marveling at the size of everything. Caleb felt like an intruder, tracking dirt across expensive rugs, his work-worn hands too rough for the delicate furniture. But Beatrice seemed lighter somehow, like having them there filled a space she'd been ignoring. "I'll start repairs tomorrow," Caleb said over dinner. "Take out Chinese food, the first time he'd had it in years. Should take a few weeks to fix the roof and dry everything out. There's no rush." Beatrice picked at her low mine. "Stay as long as you need." The days that followed developed their own rhythm. Caleb would work on his house during the day, coming back to the estate in the evenings. Rosie and Beatrice would spend hours together, painting, reading, walking by the river. The little girl bloomed under the attention, and Beatrice softened in ways Caleb hadn't known were possible. He'd find them curled up on the couch, Rosie asleep against Beatrice's shoulder, and something in his chest would ache. One evening, he found Beatrice in the kitchen, teaching Rosie how to make cookies. His daughter's hands were covered in flour, her smile huge. Beatrice's hair was coming loose from its careful arrangement. Her blouse had a streak of chocolate across it, and she looked more beautiful than he'd ever seen her. Not polished and perfect, but real and present and alive. "Daddy, look! We're making chocolate chip!" Rosie held up a misshapen ball of dough triumphantly. "I see that." Caleb leaned against the doorframe, watching them. Beatrice glanced up, caught him staring, and blushed. That's when he knew. When he felt it settle into his bones like certainty. He was falling for her. Maybe had been since that first morning at the river, when she'd looked at him like he'd given her something precious just by turning away. But love was complicated, and Beatrice carried ghosts he couldn't see. Late one night, after Rosie was asleep, Caleb found Beatrice on the back terrace, staring out at the river. The moon was full, turning everything silver. "Can't sleep?" he asked, joining her. "I keep having the same dream," she said. "About the accident, about my son." Her voice was steady but hollow. "Some nights I can't remember his face anymore. Other nights, I remember it too well." Caleb didn't touch her, though he wanted to. "Sarah used to wear this perfume," he said. "Something floral, I don't remember the name. For months after she died, I'd smell it everywhere. In the grocery store, on the street, nowhere and everywhere at once. It felt like the world was haunting me." He paused. "Then one day, I realized I couldn't remember what it smelled like anymore, and that felt worse." "How do you live with it?" Beatrice asked. "The guilt?" "I don't know that you do," Caleb said honestly. "I just know you keep living, for the people who still need you. Rosie needed me, so I kept going. Some days that was enough. Some days it wasn't. But I kept going anyway." Beatrice turned to look at him. Moonlight caught in her eyes. "What if I told you I don't know how to keep going anymore?" "I'd say you already are," Caleb said gently. "You're here. You're breathing. You're helping my daughter make cookies and skip stones. That's not giving up. That's surviving. And some days, surviving is the bravest thing you can do." Something broke in her expression. She stepped forward, and he opened his arms, and she collapsed against him. He held her while she cried, great shaking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and ancient. He didn't tell her it would be okay. He didn't promise that time would heal. He just held her and let her break. Because sometimes, that's all another person can offer, the safety to fall apart. When she finally pulled back, her face was blotchy, and her eyes were red. But something had shifted. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For not telling me it gets better. For just letting me be sad." "You're allowed to be sad," Caleb said. "You're allowed to be angry and broken and whatever else you need to be. You don't have to perform healing for anyone." She laughed, watery but real. "Where were you 3 years ago?" "Probably falling apart in my own way," he admitted. "We all do it differently." The next morning, Rosie asked Beatrice a question that changed everything. They were at the breakfast table, Caleb making pancakes, when his daughter looked up with those huge, innocent eyes and said, "Miss Beatrice, why are you always sad?" Beatrice froze, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. Caleb started to intervene, but Beatrice held up a hand. "What makes you think I'm sad, sweetheart?" "Your eyes," Rosie said simply. "They're sad. Like Daddy's eyes when he looks at Mama's picture." Caleb's throat tightened. He'd thought he'd hidden it better than that. Beatrice set down her cup carefully. "I lost someone I loved very much," she told Rosie. "My little boy. He was only a little older than you. Did he go to heaven like Mama?" "Yes." "Then he's okay," Rosie said with the absolute certainty of a child. Mama's okay in heaven. She told me in a dream. Your boy is probably okay too. Beatrice's eyes filled with tears. You think so? I know so. Rosie reached across the table and patted Beatrice's hand. And you're not alone. You have us now. Caleb watched Beatrice's face crumble and rebuild itself in the span of a heartbeat. She pulled Rosie into a hug, holding her tight, and whispered, "Thank you, baby. Thank you." That afternoon, while Rosie napped, Beatrice told Caleb more about her marriage to a powerful CEO, about the pressure and the distance, and the way they'd used their son as a bridge between them instead of building their own connection. About the day of the accident, how she'd been driving her son to soccer practice, how a truck had run a red light, how she'd swerved but not fast enough. About waking up in the hospital to learn her son was gone and her husband blamed her. About the divorce, the settlement, the way she'd taken the money and run because she couldn't stand to be in that city anymore. Couldn't stand to see the pity and the judgment in everyone's eyes. I thought coming here would help, she said. I thought if I could just disappear, become someone else, the pain would stay behind. She laughed bitterly. Doesn't work that way, does it? No, Caleb agreed. Pain is portable. They were in the living room, afternoon light slanting through the tall windows. Beatrice sat curled in a chair, Caleb on the couch across from her. The distance felt intentional, safe. Can I tell you something? She asked. Anything. That morning at the river, I didn't slip, I jumped. The words hung in the air like smoke. Caleb's chest went tight. Beatrice, I didn't want to die, she said quickly. Not really. I just wanted to feel something other than numb. The water was so cold, and when it pulled me under, I panicked. That's when I realized I didn't want to die. I wanted to live. I just didn't know how anymore. She looked at him with devastating honesty. Then you pulled me out, and you didn't look at me like I was broken. You just looked away and gave me your coat and treated me like a person. That was the first time in 3 years anyone had done that. Caleb crossed the room, knelt in front of her chair. You're not broken, he said fiercely. You're hurt. There's a difference. Is there? Yes. He took her hands in his, careful and gentle. Broken things can't heal. Hurt things can. It takes time, and it's hard, and some days you'll want to give up. But you can heal. I've seen it. You're already doing it. How can you be so sure? Because a month ago you couldn't talk about your son without shutting down. Now you just told me his story. Because you smile at Rosie's jokes. Because you made cookies and got flour in your hair and didn't care that you looked messy. Because you're here, right now, fighting. That's healing. Beatrice pulled one hand free and touched his face, her palm warm against his cheek. How did you get to be so wise? I'm not wise, Caleb said. I'm just a carpenter who's lost people and learned to keep going. That's not wisdom. That's stubbornness. She laughed, and it sounded almost carefree. Then her expression turned serious. Caleb, I need to tell you something else. Something I found out last week. The way she said it made his stomach drop. Okay. I was going through legal documents. My lawyer sent files about my divorce settlement, including information about my ex-husband's company. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Do you remember working for Hartfield Construction? The name hit Caleb like a punch. He sat back on his heels, something cold spreading through his chest. Yes. 5 years ago. You were a senior engineer there. You reported safety violations on a major project, substandard materials, budget fraud. Caleb's jaw tightened. I remember. They fired you, Beatrice continued, her voice shaking. Blacklisted you from the industry. You couldn't find work, and your wife was sick. Sarah had just been diagnosed, Caleb said quietly. The memories were acid in his throat. The insurance was through my job, When they fired me, we lost coverage. By the time I found something else, the cancer had spread. We couldn't afford the treatment she needed. He stood, putting distance between them. I don't like to think about it. Caleb. Beatrice stood too, her face pale. My ex-husband was the CEO of Hartfield Construction. I didn't know about the fraud. He kept that from me. But I was married to him. I benefited from that money, from the choices that destroyed your life. Her voice broke. If you'd kept your job, if you'd had insurance, Sarah might have... Don't. Caleb's voice was sharp. Don't finish that sentence. I have to. Tears streamed down Beatrice's face. You need to know. I'm connected to the people who took everything from you. I might as well have pulled the trigger myself. Caleb turned away, his hands shaking. The old anger rose up, the rage he'd buried 5 years ago, when he'd realized that doing the right thing had cost him everything that mattered. He'd reported the fraud because people's lives were at stake, because buildings constructed with substandard materials could collapse, could kill, and they'd destroyed him for it. Destroyed his career, his reputation, his wife's chance at survival. And now this woman he'd started to care for, this woman his daughter loved, was telling him she was part of it. I should go, Beatrice said behind him. I'll pack my things. You and Rosie can stay here as long as you need. I'll sign the property over. I'll set up a trust fund for her education, whatever you need. I can't undo what happened, but I can try to make it right. Stop. Caleb turned around. Beatrice was crying, her whole body shaking. Just stop. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. Caleb looked at her. Really looked at her. At this woman who'd been drowning in her own grief, who'd tried to disappear into a river because the pain was too much, who'd spent the last month learning to smile again because his daughter had shown her it was possible. She wasn't the CEO who'd fired him. She wasn't the board that had covered up the fraud. She was just another person who'd been hurt by systems too big to fight. It wasn't your fault, he said. Beatrice shook her head. I was part of it. You were married to someone who made terrible choices. That doesn't make you responsible for them. Caleb stepped closer. If we're going to play that game, then I'm responsible for Sarah's death too. If I'd kept my mouth shut, if I'd let them build that project with bad materials and hoped no one got hurt, I'd still have had my job. We'd have had insurance. She might have lived. His voice cracked. But people could have died in that building. Maybe they would have. Maybe they wouldn't have. I made a choice. Your ex-husband made a choice. Neither of us controlled what happened after. How can you forgive me? Beatrice asked. There's nothing to forgive, Caleb said. You're not him. You didn't know. And even if you had known, you're here now, trying to make it right. That matters. It doesn't bring her back. No. Caleb's throat was tight. Nothing brings them back. Not Sarah, not your son, not the years we lost. But we're still here. And I don't know about you, but I'm tired of letting the past decide who I get to care about. Beatrice stared at him. You still want me here? Yes. Even knowing what you know? Especially knowing. Caleb reached for her hand. You told me the truth when you could have hidden it. That takes courage. And courage like that. That's not something I want to walk away from. She collapsed against him, sobbing. Caleb held her, his own tears falling silent into her hair. They stood there for a long time, two broken people holding each other up, learning that maybe that was enough. Maybe holding each other up was how healing started. When Rosie woke from her nap, she found them sitting together on the couch, hands linked, faces blotchy from crying. She climbed between them without asking and said, Are we still a family? Caleb looked at Beatrice. Beatrice looked at him, and they both nodded. Yes, sweetheart, Caleb said. We're still a family. The weeks that followed were not easy. Beatrice had nightmares about the accident, about her son, about guilt she couldn't shake. Caleb had his own demons, memories of watching Sarah fade away, of knowing he'd done the right thing but hating the cost. They didn't fix each other. That wasn't how it worked. But they learned to sit with each other's pain, to hold space for the hard days, to not demand that healing happen on a schedule. Beatrice used her settlement money to open an investigation into Hartfield Construction. She hired lawyers, contacted other engineers who'd been silenced, pushed for accountability. It wouldn't change the past, but maybe it would prevent the same thing from happening to someone else. Caleb watched her fight, saw the fire return to her eyes, and fell deeper in love with her resilience. He finished repairing his house, but they didn't move back. The estate had stopped feeling like a mausoleum and started feeling like a home. Rosie's artwork covered the refrigerator. Caleb's tools were spread across the garage. Beatrice's laughter echoed through rooms that had been silent for too long. One morning, 3 months after the storm, Beatrice woke to find Caleb and Rosie in the kitchen, covered in sawdust. "What are you doing?" "Making you a birthday present," Rosie announced, bouncing with excitement. Beatrice blinked. "It's not my birthday." "We know," Caleb said, grinning, "but we decided you needed one anyway." They led her down to the river, where a small wooden boat waited on the shore. It was beautiful, handcrafted, with smooth lines and a tiny bench seat. Rosie's name was carved on one side, Beatrice's on the other, and on the stern, in Caleb's careful script, "The river brought us home." Beatrice pressed her hands to her mouth, tears spilling over. "You made this?" "We made it," Rosie corrected. "I helped sand." "It's not much," Caleb said, suddenly shy, "but I thought maybe we could sail it together. Make new memories." Beatrice pulled them both into a hug. "It's perfect," she whispered. "You're both perfect." They took the boat out that afternoon, the three of them cramped on the little bench, laughing when water splashed over the sides. Rosie sang at the top of her lungs, some song she'd learned at school. Caleb rowed with steady, sure strokes, and Beatrice sat between them, her hand on her daughter's shoulder, because that's what Rosie was now, in all the ways that mattered, and felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. Hope. That evening, after Rosie was asleep, Beatrice found Caleb on the back terrace again, the same place they'd stood months ago when she'd asked him how to keep going. But this time, when she looked at him, there was no desperation in her eyes, just quiet certainty. "That morning at the river," she said, "when I asked you not to look, do you remember what you said?" "I didn't say anything." "Exactly." Beatrice stepped closer. "You just turned away and gave me your coat. You didn't need me to explain. You didn't ask for my story. You just saw someone who needed help and you helped. No conditions, no expectations." She took his hands. "I've been thinking about that a lot, about how rare that is, how most people want something in return for their kindness. But you just give it freely." "That's not special," Caleb said. "That's just being human." "No." Beatrice shook her head. "Most humans aren't like you, Caleb Hayes. Most of us are too scared, too broken, too selfish. But you're good. Genuinely good. And that scares me." "Why?" "Because I don't know if I deserve it." Her voice wavered. "I don't know if I deserve you, or Rosie, or this second chance at having a family. Part of me keeps waiting for it to fall apart." Caleb cupped her face in his hands. "It might," he said honestly. "Life doesn't come with guarantees. But I know this. I love you. I love you messy and scared and healing. I love you on your good days and your bad days. And Rosie loves you. That's not going away because you think you don't deserve it. That's just how love works. It doesn't ask permission. It just is." "I love you too," Beatrice whispered. I didn't think I'd ever feel this way again. I didn't think I was allowed to. You're allowed, Caleb said. Sarah would want me to be happy. Your son would want you to live. We honor them by not giving up, by choosing to love again. She kissed him then, soft and slow and full of promise. When they pulled apart, she was smiling through tears. What do we do now? Now? Caleb grinned. Now we keep going. We make breakfast. We fix things that break. We watch Rosie grow up. We have good days and bad days. We love each other through all of it. That sounds perfect. Yeah, Caleb agreed, pulling her close. It really does. A year later, the investigation into Hartfield Construction was front-page news. 3 executives were indicted for fraud. Families of engineers who'd been wrongfully terminated received settlements. Caleb's reputation was publicly restored, his name cleared. Several engineering firms reached out with job offers, good jobs, the kind he'd thought he'd never have again. But by then, Caleb had started his own business. Small construction projects, ethical practices, fair wages. Beatrice had invested in it, not as a favor, but as a partner. They worked together, building something honest from the ruins of what they'd lost. It wasn't glamorous, but it was theirs. The day the verdicts were announced, Beatrice stood in the kitchen of what was now their home, not hers, not his, but theirs, and cried. Not from sadness this time, but from relief, from the weight of finally letting go. Caleb found her there, wrapped his arms around her. You did it, he said. You made it right. We did it, she corrected. I couldn't have done it without you. That's what partners do. She turned in his arms, looked up at him. Marry me. Caleb blinked. What? Marry me, Beatrice repeated. I know it's fast. I know we're still healing. But I don't want to wait anymore. I want to build a life with you officially. I want to be Rosie's mother legally. I want all of it. Do you? Caleb laughed, the sound bright and free. Yes, God, yes. They married by the river on a summer morning, with Rosie as the flower girl and half the town as witnesses. It was simple. No fancy venue, no expensive catering, just friends and family and love. When the officiant asked if they had vows, Caleb spoke first. I'm not good with words, he said, holding Beatrice's hands. But I know this. The river brought you to me when I wasn't looking for anyone. You were drowning, and I pulled you out. But the truth is, you saved me too. You and Rosie. You gave me a reason to be more than just a man going through the motions. You gave me hope, and I promise to spend the rest of my life returning that gift. I promise to love you on the hard days. I promise to hold you when you can't hold yourself. I promise to never stop trying to be worthy of this second chance we've been given. Beatrice was crying, but she was smiling too. I don't have anything written down, she said, but I'll tell you what I know. That morning at the river, I asked you not to look, and you turned away. That was the moment I realized what real kindness looked like. You saw me at my worst, and you chose compassion. You've been choosing it every day since. You taught me that healing isn't linear, that it's okay to be broken, that love doesn't require perfection. You taught Rosie, our daughter, that family isn't always blood. It's the people who show up, who stay. And I promise to keep showing up. For you, for her, for us. Every single day. When they kissed, Rosie cheered, and the small crowd applauded, and Caleb felt Sarah's presence like a warm breeze. Not sad, just peaceful. A blessing. Permission to move forward. The reception was held at the estate, now legally belonging to all 3 of them. People danced and laughed and ate cake. Rosie ran wild with the other kids, her dress already grass-stained. Beatrice watched her with such love that Caleb's chest ached. What are you thinking? He asked, pulling her into a slow dance, even though the music was fast. "That I almost missed this," Beatrice said. "If I'd stayed in that river, if you hadn't pulled me out, I'd have never known this was possible. I'd have never met Rosie, never fallen in love with you, never learned that the worst thing that ever happened to me didn't have to be the end of my story." "It's not the end," Caleb agreed. "It's just the middle. We've got a lot more story to write." "Good," Beatrice rested her head against his chest. "Because I'm not done living yet." The years that followed were full and rich. They had fights and makeups and quiet mornings and chaotic evenings. They watched Rosie grow into a remarkable young woman who inherited Beatrice's fire and Caleb's kindness. They built a life that wasn't perfect, but was profoundly theirs. They planted a garden. They fixed up the boat and took it out on good weather days. They created traditions and inside jokes and a home that felt safe. Some mornings, Beatrice still woke with tears on her face from dreams of her son. Some evenings, Caleb still felt the ghost of Sarah's absence, but they'd learned to hold space for those griefs without letting them define their present. The past was part of them, but it wasn't all of them. On the 5th anniversary of the day they met, Caleb and Beatrice walked down to the river at dawn, the same spot where everything had changed. The water was calm, reflecting the pink-gold sky. "Do you ever think about that morning?" Beatrice asked. "Every day," Caleb admitted. "What do you think about? How cold you were, how scared, how brave you were to trust a stranger." He turned to her. "How lucky I am that the river brought you to me." Beatrice smiled, the kind of smile that reached her eyes and lit up her whole face. "I used to think the water took everything from me that day. My dignity, my pride, my clothes." She laughed softly. "But it didn't take anything. It brought me to exactly where I needed to be." "Which is?" "Home." She squeezed his hand. "Not a place. People. You and Rosie. The family I didn't think I deserved but needed more than anything." They stood there as the sun rose fully, turning the river to liquid gold. Somewhere behind them, Rosie was probably waking up. Probably already planning some elaborate breakfast she'd insist on making. Their life was waiting, messy, and beautiful, and real. "Ready to go back?" Caleb asked. Beatrice took one last look at the river, at the place where she'd almost ended her story, but instead began a new chapter. "Yeah," she said. "I'm ready." They walked back up the path together, hand in hand, leaving the river behind. But its lesson stayed with them, carved into their hearts like Rosie's name on that little boat. Sometimes the things that look like endings are actually beginnings. Sometimes being saved means learning to save yourself. And sometimes the water doesn't take away. It brings you exactly where you need to be. The door to their home stood open, warm light spilling out. Inside, they could hear Rosie singing off-key, probably burning something on the stove. Normal. Ordinary. Perfect. Caleb looked at Beatrice. Beatrice looked at him. And without a word, they smiled and walked inside, ready for whatever the day would bring. Because they'd learned the most important lesson of all, that healing isn't about forgetting the pain. It's about choosing to live despite it. It's about building something new from the broken pieces. It's about love that doesn't ask for perfection, just presence. It's about showing up day after day for the people who need you and the people you need. It's about grace and second chances and the courage to try again. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it's about a river that brings you home.